Steve Harvey dropped the microphone. It hit the Family Feud stage floor with a metallic thud that echoed through the silent studio. 300 people held their breath as America's most confident host turned his back on the cameras and walked away. Nobody moved. The contestants stood frozen at the podium. Producers in the control room frantically whispered into headsets. Something had just broken through the carefully constructed walls of television's funniest game show host. But this wasn't about comedy. This wasn't about ratings. This was about a two-word answer that ripped open a wound Steve Harvey had spent 30 years trying to heal. Let me take you back to how we got here. Because what happened on that Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta wasn't just a game show moment. It was the collision of past and present, of buried pain and unavoidable truth. And it started 3 decades before that microphone hit the floor. The setup nobody saw coming. It was March 2017. Steve Harvey was at the peak of his Family Feud reign. The show was crushing ratings. His reactions to outrageous answers had become internet gold. Memes of his stunned face circulated millions of times daily. He'd survived the Miss Universe debacle. He'd built an empire spanning television, radio, books, and motivational speaking. From the outside, Steve Harvey was untouchable. The Martinez family from Sacramento was competing against the Patterson family from Detroit. Standard stuff. 5 rounds of survey says, the energy was electric as always. Steve was in his element, working the crowd with that signature blend of humor and warmth that had made him America's favorite game show host. The question seemed innocent enough. Simple, actually. One of those softball questions that usually gets the crowd laughing and the family scrambling for obvious answers. Name something a father teaches his son. The Martinez family had control of the board. Robert Martinez, the family patriarch, had already given a solid answer. How to throw a ball. Number 3 on the board. His wife followed with how to drive. Number 2. The family was rolling. They were on track for an easy win. Then it was David Martinez's turn. 28 years old, Marine veteran, father of 2. He stepped up to the microphone with confidence. Steve leaned in with that expectant smile, ready for another standard answer that would keep the game moving. But David hesitated. Just for a second, something shifted in his expression. A shadow crossed his face, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that stopped everyone. How to leave. The moment everything stopped, the studio audience gasped, not the theatrical gasp of shocked entertainment. This was different. This was the collective inhale of people who suddenly understood they were witnessing something real, something raw, something that transcended the bright lights and the game board. Steve Harvey's smile froze. His hand, which had been gesturing toward the board, stopped mid-motion. For maybe 3 seconds, he stood completely still. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much. But on live television, with cameras rolling and an audience watching, 3 seconds is an eternity. Then Steve did something that veteran crew members would later say they'd never seen in 15 years of working with him. He set down his card stack with deliberate care, looked at David Martinez with an expression that was impossible to read, and, without a word to the producers, without acknowledging the cameras, without asking permission, Steve Harvey walked off the stage. Not a dramatic storm-off, not a comedy bit, just a quiet, purposeful exit that left everyone in the studio confused and concerned. The microphone lay on the floor where it had fallen. David Martinez stood at the podium, looking stricken, clearly worried he'd said something terribly wrong. The other family members exchanged panicked glances. The Patterson family across the stage didn't know whether to stay in position or break formation. In the control room, executive producer Jennifer Morrison made a split-second decision. Keep rolling, she told the camera operators. Do not cut away. Why this answer hit different. But here's what the audience didn't know, what the contestants didn't know, what nobody except Steve Harvey's closest circle understood in that moment. That answer, how to leave, wasn't just an answer. It was Steve's biography in 2 words. To understand why Steve walked off that stage, you have to go back to Cleveland, Ohio, 1973. Steve Harvey was 16 years old. His father, Jesse Harvey, was a coal miner, tough man, provider. The kind of father who showed love through work, through putting food on the table, through keeping the lights on. But Jesse Harvey taught his son something else too. Something Steve spent decades trying to unlearn. He taught him that when life gets hard, when responsibilities feel overwhelming, when the walls start closing in, you leave. you walk away. You find the exit. Jesse never abandoned the family permanently, but he had his patterns: disappear for days, come back without explanation, leave during arguments, return when things cooled down. It was a cycle young Steve watched and absorbed, the way children absorb their parents' unspoken lessons. 20 years later, when Steve Harvey's first marriage was crumbling under the weight of his comedy career, under the pressure of constant travel and financial struggle, under the strain of dreams that demanded everything, Steve found himself repeating his father's pattern. He left. Not once, multiple times. Pack a bag, get in the car, drive until the guilt overwhelms the escape. Return, repeat. His first wife, Marcia, endured years of this cycle. Steve would later admit in his book that he spent more nights in comedy club green rooms and cheap motels than he did in his own bed during those years. The pattern followed him through relationships, through the homeless years when leaving was easier than staying and facing failure, through the early years of fame when success gave him more resources to run, through his second marriage when the same demons whispered the same lies. It wasn't until his third marriage to Marjorie, and years of therapy he rarely discusses publicly, that Steve finally confronted this inherited behavior, finally looked at himself and recognized his father's escape artist DNA, living in his own decisions. So when David Martinez said how to leave on that Family Feud stage, Steve Harvey didn't hear a game show answer. He heard his own history. He heard his father's footsteps walking out the door. He heard his own car starting in the driveway at 3 in the morning. He heard every moment of cowardice he'd spent 30 years trying to atone for. Behind the scenes, the 10 minutes that changed television, the cameras kept rolling, but the game show stopped. Stage managers didn't know whether to go to commercial, restart the round, or call for medical assistance. Steve had vanished through the backstage curtain without a word. Jennifer Morrison made her way down from the control room. She'd worked with Steve for 8 years at that point. She'd seen him handle controversial answers, inappropriate responses, and emotional contestants, but she'd never seen him walk away. She found him in his private dressing room, sitting on the leather couch, head in his hands, not crying, not angry, just sitting in that particular kind of stillness that comes when the past ambushes the present. "Steve," Jennifer said carefully, "what do you need?" Steve was quiet for a long moment. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something Jennifer had never seen before: vulnerability, complete, unguarded vulnerability. "That answer," Steve said quietly, "that's the worst thing my daddy taught me, and I passed it on before I knew better." Jennifer sat down. She understood this wasn't about the show anymore. This was about a man facing a mirror he hadn't asked to look into. "His son is going to see this," Steve continued, his voice rough. "That kid's going to see his daddy on national TV, and that's going to be the answer he remembers: how to leave. Like it's normal. Like it's what fathers do." Then Steve did something that would alter the course of that taping and ultimately change how Family Feud approached emotional moments forever. "I need to talk to him," Steve said. "Not on camera, not for the show. I need to tell him something." The conversation nobody was supposed to hear. Jennifer Morrison made a call that could have gotten her fired. She told the audience they were taking an extended break. She kept the studio warm, but gave Steve privacy. And she sent someone to bring David Martinez backstage. What happened in that dressing room wasn't recorded. The conversation was private. But David Martinez later described it in an interview that gained surprisingly little media attention, perhaps because the story was too real, too raw for the entertainment news cycle that feeds on scandal rather than substance. Steve Harvey apologized first, for walking off, for making David feel like he'd done something wrong. Then he asked David a question that opened the floodgates. "Your daddy leave you?" David nodded. "Age 7. Father walked out, never came back. Classic story. Tragic story. Common story." "Mine left too," Steve said. "Not forever, but enough times that I learned how, and then I did it to my own kids before I figured out I was recreating the worst parts of my old man." The two men talked for almost 20 minutes. Steve shared things he'd never said publicly about the shame of repeating generational patterns, about the years it took to recognize that the escape instinct was learned, not innate, about having to actively choose every single day to stay when things got hard. David shared his own story, how he joined the Marines partially to prove he could commit to something, How he'd married his high school sweetheart because she stayed when everyone else in his life left. How he'd vowed his own sons would never know what it felt like to wonder if dad was coming home. And then David said something that brought the conversation full circle. "But I'm terrified," he admitted. "Terrified that one day it's going to be too much, and I'm going to do what he did, what your daddy did. Just walk away because I don't know how to do anything else when it hurts." Steve Harvey stood up, looked David Martinez in the eye, and said words that would later become a cornerstone of his motivational speaking. "Then we're going to make a pact right here. You and me, every time you feel like leaving, you call me. Middle of the night, middle of a fight, middle of whatever. You call me and I'll tell you what somebody should have told your daddy and mine. Staying is the bravest thing a man can do." Steve Harvey gave David Martinez his personal cell phone number that day, not his assistant's number, not a business line, his personal phone, the same number his own children use. The return to stage, when television became ministry, when Steve Harvey walked back onto that Family Feud stage, something had shifted. The audience, who'd been entertained throughout the extended break by warm-up comedians and dance music, sensed immediately that their host was different. Steve stood center stage. No cards, no podium between him and the contestants. He looked directly at David Martinez, who stood nervously at the family podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve began, his voice carrying an authority that transcended entertainment, "I apologize for walking off. That wasn't professional, but sometimes life hands you a moment that's more important than professionalism." The studio was absolutely silent. This wasn't the Steve Harvey of viral reaction videos. This was someone else, someone real. "David gave an answer that knocked me sideways," Steve continued. He said fathers teach their sons how to leave. And you know what? That answer's not on the board. The audience started to groan, thinking it was a standard game show moment, but Steve raised his hand. "But that answer is true. For too many of us, that's the truth. That's what we learned. That's what we inherited. And that's what we've got to stop teaching." Steve turned to face the cameras directly. Millions of viewers at home watching, recording devices in pockets around the studio. This moment was going to live forever in some form. If you're watching this, and you're thinking about leaving your family, your kids, your responsibilities because it's hard, I need you to hear me. Leaving is what cowards do, and I know because I've been that coward. Staying, fighting, showing up even when you don't have answers, that's what real men do. That's what real fathers do. The audience erupted, not in game show applause, in something deeper, recognition, agreement, the kind of applause that says somebody finally said it. Steve walked over to David Martinez, extended his hand. When David shook it, Steve pulled him into a hug that lasted several seconds. When they separated, both men had tears in their eyes. "Your answer wasn't on the board," Steve said loud enough for everyone to hear. "But you just taught your sons something more important than any game show victory. You taught them that some truths need to be said out loud, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The game continued. The Martinez family ended up losing that round, but winning the overall match. But nobody was talking about points or money. They were talking about the moment Steve Harvey stopped being a host and became a human being who understood that some conversations matter more than entertainment. The aftermath that nobody expected. The episode aired 3 months later. Network executives debated heavily about whether to include Steve's walk-off. Some argued it broke the fourth wall of game show television. Others worried it was too raw, too unscripted for the Family Feud brand. Jennifer Morrison fought to keep it in. All of it. The walk-off, the extended break, Steve's return speech, everything. "This is the most important piece of television we've ever shot," she told network executives. "This is the moment Family Feud becomes more than a game show. This is when it becomes a platform for real conversations." They kept it in, every second. The reaction was unprecedented. The episode became the most watched Family Feud of the season. But more than that, it started a conversation that rippled far beyond television. Men started calling Steve Harvey's radio show to share their own stories of inherited abandonment patterns. Therapy groups began discussing the concept of learned leaving. Social workers started using the episode in sessions with struggling fathers. David Martinez became an unexpected advocate for father engagement programs. He started speaking at churches and community centers about breaking generational cycles. And yes, he keeps Steve Harvey's phone number in his favorites. He's never had to use it, but knowing it's there has made all the difference. The business card that became a movement. 3 months after the episode aired, Steve Harvey launched what he calls the Stay Initiative. It's not a formal organization. No corporate structure, no fundraising appeals, just a simple concept built on that moment with David Martinez. Men who struggle with the urge to leave their families can text a specific number. They receive an automated response with Steve's voice delivering a 1-minute message about staying being strength, but they also get connected to a network of mentors, men who fought the same battle and won. The initiative has served over 50,000 men in its first 2 years. No media coverage, no press releases, just quiet, persistent work in the lives of families who need someone to tell them that staying matters. Steve rarely talks about it publicly, but those close to him say it's become the work he's most proud of, more than the television shows, more than the books, more than the comedy specials and the sold-out arenas. "This is my redemption," Steve told his wife Marjorie during a private conversation that she later shared with his permission. "This is how I make up for every time I ran instead of stayed." The legacy of one answer. David Martinez's answer wasn't on the board that day. How to Leave didn't make the Family Feud survey, but it made history for a different reason. It became the answer that proved game shows can be more than entertainment, that television can be a mirror that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when the script gets thrown away and humanity takes over. Steve Harvey has hosted thousands of Family Feud episodes since that March 2017 taping. He's heard countless outrageous answers. He's had dozens of viral moments. But when interviewers ask him about his most memorable episode, he always comes back to David Martinez. "That's the day I realized my job isn't to be funny," Steve has said in multiple interviews. "My job is to create space for truth, and sometimes truth is funny, but sometimes truth is hard, and that's when it matters most." The Martinez family still watches Family Feud together every night. It's their tradition. Their reminder that one moment of vulnerable honesty can change everything. David's sons, now teenagers, know the story. They've watched the episode. They understand what their father's answer really meant, and they know their dad isn't going anywhere. Not because leaving isn't in his DNA, but because staying is a choice he makes every single day, a choice that's harder and braver than any escape. Why this story matters now. In an era of carefully curated social media presence and filtered reality, Steve Harvey's walk-off remains startlingly authentic. It's a reminder that behind the success, behind the laughter, behind the television persona, there are real people fighting real battles with inherited pain. The question, "Name something a father teaches his son," will probably come up again on Family Feud. Maybe it already has. And the answers will be normal, expected. How to ride a bike, how to shave, how to treat women with respect. All good answers, all true answers, but none as honest as how to leave. Because David Martinez said out loud what millions of children have experienced in silence. He named the lesson nobody wants to admit they learned, and in doing so, he gave Steve Harvey permission to confront his own history, to acknowledge his own failings, to transform his own pain into purpose. That's why Steve dropped the microphone and walked off stage. Not because he couldn't handle the answer, but because he respected it too much to treat it like just another game show moment. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop the show. Acknowledge that what's happening is too important for entertainment, that some truths demand we pause, listen, and respond with our full humanity. Steve Harvey did that on a Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta, and in doing so, he taught millions of viewers something more valuable than any survey answer. He taught us that staying is heroic, that confronting inherited pain is necessary, that breaking generational cycles requires first admitting they exist, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're brave enough to drop the script and speak from the wounded, healed, and healing places in our hearts. The microphone was picked up. The show continued. The lights stayed bright, but something fundamental had shifted. Family Feud had become something more, and Steve Harvey had proven that entertainment and truth don't have to be enemies. They can be partners, if we're brave enough to let them.